Two, one. Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Sam Sugar with the latest in our series of victim videos. For those of you who haven't been following, we're interviewing people who have been involved in exploitative and abusive guardianships. And today, we have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Dariush Saghafi from Ohio. Good evening, sir.
Hi, how are you, Dr. Sugar?
Very good. Thank you for joining us. As I mentioned in the introduction, we do these videos so that people can begin to let others in whatever line of work they're in understand the problems that come about, the really serious problems that come about from these hotspot judges and courts in guardianship. So let me ask you some questions. Who is this guardianship concerning?
My mother.
And how long has this been going on?
Since May 2013, roughly.
So 5.5 years, something like that?
Going on, yeah, that's right.
And how did this guardianship begin? What was the impetus for someone going to a lawyer to start a guardianship?
So, of course, you know, there could be a lot more to the story, but in a nutshell, an estranged member of the family, actually a sister of the family, came in to basically, for lack of a better term, abduct my mother and take her away, physically away from the home that she had been living at for well over 50 some years. And in the meantime, we had found out later that this sister, and when I say estranged, I mean she had had no formal contact with the family for nearly 5 years before she came in and took my mother away. And we found out later that she had been in the background orchestrating meetings with an attorney, with an attorney by the name of Lisa Hahn, in order to begin the process of a divorce proceeding against my father. And at the same time that that was happening, they, in parallel, hired another attorney by the name of Mark Shearer to write estate plans, actually overwriting estate plans that she had already filed with another attorney. And that was done my mother had filed her estate plans when she was sound of mind in the year 2010. And the estate plans then were rewritten and overwritten and refiled by this other attorney in 2013, which basically took all authority and power away from us, from myself. I was the executor, basically, of that estate plan for her, and that's how it started. That's how the whole thing started.
So this was a well thought out, meticulous, tactical approach to gain control of, I imagine, the assets primarily, and secondarily, the person of your mother.
Correct.
Did your mother have any inkling that this was going on?
At that time, no, because she was in a state of dementia, actually. She was suffering from a state of significant cognitive decline. And in the month that she was actually taken from the home, from my parents' home, she had been wandering that weekend that this sister came in.
So it might appear that she would need some kind of help, but she had made her intentions very clear in her advance directives, did she not?
Yes, she did. She did.
So what happened to those advance directives, which I assume cost a fair amount of money to make, and were the documents upon which the entire family nominally would have depended?
They were later completely erased by the court, by the probate court that got involved. Those estate documents were just completely put under and I don't know what the legal procedure was, but this new set of documents, this new estate plan, if you will, which put another attorney as the guardian and so forth in charge of everything, went into place somewhere in the year, I'm just guessing now because you know, I don't have the paperwork in front of me, but it was about in the year 2014 that it was all finalized, and those documents were finally reversed or rescinded, or whatever the legal term is.
So an estranged family member, that's the definition, I guess, of a family dysfunction. An estranged family member created a tactical orchestrated assault on your mother's person and assets, and it culminated in her kidnapping your mother.
Exactly.
Literally, and eventually winding up in a plenary guardianship, I suppose, by a professional guardian?
No, by an attorney who ends up being a neighbor of the probate judge. He lives literally across the street from him. And
so the judge decided that it would be the best for your mother to have his neighbor and friend take over the estate of your mother, when your family, I presume, was perfectly willing to do so.
Absolutely.
And this whole thing came as a surprise to everybody but your estranged sister.
Correct.
Are there other siblings involved?
Yes, my brothers. There are 4 of us in total, aside from the sister, and so none of us were even aware of the previous work that she had gone through, she being the sister, to put all this in the background and then come and take my mother away. We were completely blindsided by that entire plan.
As are most victims. I will ask you then, in that vein, did you receive what's referred to as due process, meaning you are definitely an interested party because you were named to be the attorney in fact or whatever in the advance directives? Did you ever receive notification from the court that a guardianship was underway?
We actually filed for a guardianship for my mother. When this
you had done so previously?
When the abduction actually took place, the very next thing that and the estate plan had been rewritten by that point, by the time we went through court, and we filed for the guardianship of my mother.
I see.
At that point. So we filed
to fight back against the cap.
That's right. We didn't want to go that route. We didn't think it would be necessary to go that route. But as soon as the abduction took place, which was actually on April 13th, 2013, as soon as that happened, we filed for guardianship. And then within a day or 2 or 3 of that, the sister filed for guardianship as well.
And so the classical setup of families arguing over a loved one opens the door for a judge to give the person and the estate to one of his buddies.
Yes. Now, originally, you'll have to know that in this case, his buddy did not get involved until later in about 2014. The judge initially gave control over to the sister as being both financial, as well as guardian of person, as well as guardian of estate and finances. However, she, being the type of person she is, which, if it's of any interest to you now, she is a convicted felon. She is now a convicted felon for other charges that were leveled against her and her husband. But at that time, she wasn't. So she was able to obtain this guardianship through the courts over our objections and over our testimony that she was unfit, over testimony even of her eldest son.
Right. So let me ask you, in the process of all of this, when the struggle between siblings was going on, were you vilified by the other side? Were other family members vilified by the estranged sister and her lawyers?
Well, yes. They vilified us because they made it appear that they wanted this to come out in court that the only reason we had any interest in my mother was for the estate wealth that was in the
That was
book.
in play, yeah.
And that was just to remind you, the divorce proceeding had been launched prior to the probate proceeding.
Right. Well, that's the way it's typically done. In order to get to the entire estate, you try to divorce a couple that's been married forever, get the husband, in this case, out of the way so that you can steal the entire estate and not have to deal with the husband. I want to get back to vilification, though. What were you accused of other than being greedy?
Nothing else to my knowledge that I can recall. We apparently were not taking care of my mother adequately according to what the sister claimed, because my mother had been found wandering on a couple of occasions. And so we weren't, in her opinion, adequately caring for her in that regard.
Is that what triggered her attack on you?
No, not necessarily. She simply took my mother on a false pretense that she was going to simply take her for that weekend that she had wandered off and come back. My father went out and got her, brought her back to the house, and my sister was called by my brothers actually to come over, and they told her, things are kind of deteriorating here with Mom. You better come over and maybe we can all sit down and figure out what to do. And then my sister says, well, let me take her for the weekend and help sort of nurse her back to help.
So once this guardianship finally took hold, what happened to your mother?
Well, she lived with the sister and her husband for a while in her house. The sister became a benefactor of about roughly $4,000 per month as a stipend to be taking care of her. This was awarded by the judge to her for fees and expenses and rent and all of this, none of which we would have charged my mother in the least, none of which we even thought of charging her for any reason. Yet the sister was the beneficiary and the recipient of that amount of money. And then this went on for a while until the sister was taken to jail because of a scam she and her husband had been pursuing for 2 years prior to this against the public school system where she lives, which are felony charges. And so she's now a convicted felon. And basically, as a result of all of that, my mother ended up in a nursing home.
As is always the case. In the nursing home, is she thriving?
We haven't seen her, Dr. Sugar. We haven't been allowed to see her during this entire process.
Now, is that because the judge issued an order for you to stay away?
The judge did not issue an order at this point. He has agreed with the guardian that we would be able to visit with my mother under at least 11 different constraints, including being accompanied by, now this was in an original list, it's not in the actual list. Now, the guardian wanted us to be accompanied by an off-duty police officer.
Very common.
And the judge did not agree to that in the end, but the judge did agree to every other constraint that the guardian placed, which included, the guardian said we were not allowed to speak to my mother about anything having to do with the guardianship, right, about anything having to do with the guardian or the judge or anything. We were basically being gagged to speak to her about anything other than saying, hello, how are you? Everything's well with us.
And was the excuse for this that you would upset your mother?
Yes, and they said this in court.
That's the universal story.
This was stated in court. It's in the record. It's in the transcript. That and it's a conversation between the judge, and it's a dialogue between the judge and the guardian. Well, you know how Mrs. Bakhtiar is always gets upset about these things when we talk to her about. Now, mind you, we're supposedly talking about an incompetent, incapacitated individual as of several years ago who, by cognitive assessments, is not able to even fend for her own affairs. Yet a conversation regarding something as complex as a guardianship for somebody who's neurocognitively impaired, somehow these folks are still worried 6 years later that this would offend, upset, and make this person angry for some odd reason.
And we should point out right now that you are a specialist physician in neurology.
Yes, I'm a neurologist.
And that makes you pretty much an expert in this field.
It makes me an absolute expert in this field because I deal with behaviorally disoriented people all the time. Dysfunctional dementia, neurodegenerative diseases are my mainstay of treatments and management.
Has your mother been medicated in the nursing home?
She's been medicated with some agents. We're not sure what her medication regimen is now. We have been entirely cut off and prevented from having any contact with the doctors, with the nursing home. Any move that we make to try to make contact is viewed as a direct violation of the guardian's orders, which then he runs to the judge. Every time we do anything to try to get access to her, he runs immediately to the judge. The judge then puts out an order of some sort.
And these orders are usually ex parte orders, I presume.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's very common too. So despite the fact that there are little twists and turns in all of these stories, the basic underlying theme is the same. It's litigate, isolate, medicate, take the estate. What impact has all of this had on your family, on your marriage, on your children, on you personally?
Well, if you can't tell from the tone of my voice at all as to how this has impacted me, then I can tell you that I'm exercising as much restraint as possible during this conversation, because every time I go through any type of dialogue involving this, it really activates some of the most gut-wrenching and nerve-grinding spots in my being, because I frankly never expected this type of treatment from our justice system. And of course, law enforcement has entirely looked the other way with our complaints. And
they've told you that it's a civil matter, right?
They've told us it's a civil matter. They've told us that there's really nothing wrong, that we're making up things, that this is not anything to be upset about because we're looking at it in a different way. The judge has control over it. The guardian is well known. He's well respected. All of these things. The justice system and the legal enforcement system has absolutely not just failed us, Dr. Sugar, but they have openly abused us as a family. So that's how I feel about it.
With regard to money, and a lot of people focus on the money involved in guardianships. I ask them not to. I ask them to focus on what you just finished talking about, the emotional impact, psychological damage, and not to mention what's going on with the ward. I would imagine that your mother, the ward, is not thriving. In nursing homes, I imagine she's not getting enough sunlight, so her bones will be brittle. I imagine she's not getting a high-level diet, and I would imagine she's getting a lot of medications that she probably doesn't need or would benefit from. But having said all that, how much money has been wiped out as a result of this, both yours and the estate's?
A conservative estimate at this point would be about $3.5 million has gone into this so far, and there's still more to come. We still are in litigation, which has proven to be absolutely useless. The appeals courts, as I have spoken to other people about, are simply rubber stamping everything that the probate judge puts in front of them. And as a result of that, we spend more and more money. I mean, the attorneys are getting, you know, very rich in this whole thing.
Well,
On
you
both
can be
sides.
sure that when the money's all gone, they will disappear.
That's correct, in my opinion as well. I concur.
And until the money's all gone, they will find more ways for pointless, ridiculous stage litigation. And the story that you've just told us is word for word almost what everybody else tells us. There is a racket going on in the United States in probate and conservatorship courtrooms. It isn't everywhere, and it isn't every guardianship or conservatorship, but in hotspots, apparently in Ohio, and we know about California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Michigan, Illinois, and New York, and probably every other state. There are hotspots in all of these states, and you had the misfortune of having the perfect storm. A family dysfunction so severe that a tactical maneuver was pulled on your family in order to extract the wealth that your parents had worked for their entire lives. And it was so easy for them. So easy. What would you say to someone who is naive about all of this? How would you speak to them? What would you warn them about? What would you say?
Well, interesting question, because now that this has happened to us, my wife and I in particular have been thinking about how to educate our children in terms of the red flags to look for. Not that they should be suspicious of one another, but in the end, and at the end of the day, as I've researched this material, and I'm sure you can tell me about whether I'm right or wrong, but the vast majority of elder abuse when it comes to financial and other concerns where assets are taken, where people are disconnected from their families, actually occurs by children or by siblings within a family or by close family members. The vast majority of abusive guardianships are not necessarily coming from the outside. Those do occur perhaps with facilitation from other family members at times, but the vast majority of elder abuse per se and abuse of finances comes right from the children themselves.
Yeah, we find it's either first or second degree relatives that open the door to these litigation feasts by way of family dysfunction. The judges, interestingly, the judges claim they don't know who to believe. They don't know whether to believe you or your sister. And so, well, I'm going to give it to the guy who lives across the street that I golf with. We hear it all the time. And despite the fact that these judges, and I'm sure you'll attest to this, have no inclination, or they say resources to monitor or supervise these guardianships, they continue to make newer and newer guardianships in Florida, 7,000 new guardianships a year, 60,000 more or less at any given time in the state. And I don't know the numbers in Ohio, but I'm sure they reflect the same factors that are here. So in closing, what advice would you give two groups of people? The first group are victims like yourself. The second group are potential victims. What would you say to them?
Well, at this point in time, Dr. Sugar, to be quite honest, my advice to the victims, as we have become victims, is to be, number one, absolutely vigilant about your environment, about the environment of the parents or whomever it is that seems to be having trouble in the family from a neurocognitive point of view or anything of that nature, because they are a target. They are a target. Who may be targeting them is difficult to say. I think it's almost like a person in the military uniform that's at war. They know that there's danger all around them. They just don't know from exactly where it may come. So you simply have to keep your head on a swivel, as we like to say in rugby,
But
and you
the
keep
but
your head on a
the
swivel.
fact is that there are a lot of people who spot cases for attorneys and guardians, and many of them work in hospitals. I know you work in a hospital as well, but when somebody who appears to have difficulty with their mentation in any way and who isn't being seen on a regular basis by a relative or family member, they have a big target on their back. And it's not unusual at all for guardianships to begin in the social work department of hospitals or facilities. There's a lot of money to be made by that. And what would you say to the naive, to people who are watching this and say, what is this guy talking about?
Right. Which we probably fit into that category just before all of this hit. We as everyone probably felt that this could never happen to us. Nothing like this would happen because you trust your family. You trust people in your family. As much conflict as there might be between siblings, or as many arguments as you might get into with somebody in your family, you never think that they would pull this sort of a stunt on you. So again, I think to somebody who's naive, they need to educate themselves. They need to educate themselves on the probate system and how it works in our country. It's broken. It's severely broken. And because of that,
that is the main reason I wrote my book. And I'm going to give myself a plug. This is the book. This is the book. Go get it. It tells you everything you're going to be afraid to learn about guardianships in the United States, especially the 5 to 12% that turn out like this one. I want to thank you, Doctor. We will publish this very shortly.